That was a gripping and powerful story. The tension, the realism, and the way you built up Colonel Anderson's quiet strength made it compelling from start to finish. Do you want any refinements or additions? Maybe a deeper dive into Reynolds' downfall or the aftermath for Michael's family? Let me know how I can help fine-tune it. The night was heavy with the scent of rain-soaked asphalt. Streetlights buzzed faintly, casting an eerie glow over the quiet highway cutting through a small Georgia town. It was the kind of place where time moved slow, where faces were familiar, and where some old traditions, both good and bad, refused to die. Colonel Michael Anderson had been driving for hours, his uniform neatly pressed, his posture straight even behind the wheel of his black Chevy Tahoe. At 48 years old, he had dedicated nearly 3 decades of his life to the United States Army, serving in multiple deployments, leading soldiers through war zones, and making sacrifices that few could comprehend. His face bore the quiet strength of a man who had seen both the worst and the best of humanity. Tonight, though, he wasn't a commanding officer on a battlefield. He was just a man heading home from a military conference at Fort Benning, eager to see his wife, Lisa, and their 2 teenage sons. He had promised them a movie night, and though he was running late, he still planned to keep that promise. The highway was nearly empty, save for a few late-night travelers. The rhythmic hum of the tires against the road was almost meditative, until the sharp flash of red and blue lights shattered the peace. Michael glanced at the rearview mirror. A patrol car. His heartbeat remained steady. He was no stranger to being stopped, sometimes for minor infractions, other times for no reason at all. As a black man in America, he had learned long ago that respect and composure were his best weapons in these situations. Sighing, he signaled, eased onto the shoulder, and rolled down his window as the cruiser pulled up behind him. A moment later, heavy boots crunched against the gravel. License and registration. The voice was cold, authoritative, and unmistakably laced with contempt. Michael turned his head and found himself staring into the hard eyes of Officer Travis Reynolds, a man whose uniform fit a little too snugly over his broad frame, his posture screaming dominance. There was something in his smirk, the way his fingers tapped impatiently against the holster of his gun, that sent a warning through Michael's gut. This wasn't just a traffic stop. This was a test. Colonel Michael Anderson remained calm, his hands resting on the steering wheel where the officer could see them. "Evening, officer," Michael said, keeping his voice level. Officer Travis Reynolds didn't respond immediately. Instead, he leaned down, his flashlight sweeping over the car's interior. His eyes lingered on the neatly folded Army uniform hanging in the back seat before locking back onto Michael. "I said, license and registration?" His voice was sharper this time, impatient. Michael nodded and moved slowly. Experience had taught him that sudden movements could escalate a situation like this far too quickly. He reached for his wallet with deliberate care, retrieving his license, then leaned over to the glove compartment for the registration. As he did, he heard the unmistakable click of a gun holster being unsnapped. "Slowly," Reynolds warned. Michael froze for a moment before continuing, pulling out the registration and insurance. He handed them over, watching as Reynolds glanced at the documents, then back at him. "You in the military?" the officer asked, his lip curling slightly. "Yes, sir," Michael replied. "Colonel Anderson, United States Army." Reynolds let out a low chuckle. "That so? Funny, 'cause I don't recall seeing too many colonels driving through this town this time of night." Michael ignored the bait. He had encountered men like Reynolds before, officers who saw their badge not as a duty but as a weapon, a tool of power over those they thought beneath them. "Is there a reason you pulled me over, officer?" he asked, his voice steady. Reynolds smirked. "You were going a little fast back there." Michael glanced at the speedometer. He knew for a fact he had been under the limit. "I see," he said carefully. Reynolds folded his arms, glancing at Michael's ID again. "Step out of the car." Michael tensed. There was no reason for this. No law justified this demand. But he also knew refusing could escalate things further. "Is there a problem?" he asked. "You deaf, Colonel?" Reynolds sneered. "I said step out of the car." A long silence stretched between them. Michael's mind raced. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. This wasn't just about a traffic stop. This was about something else: power, control, intimidation. Michael had led soldiers in combat. He had faced insurgents, survived ambushes, and made decisions that determined life and death. And yet, here he was on a quiet highway in America, facing an entirely different kind of battlefield. Finally, he exhaled and pushed open the door. As soon as he stepped out, Reynolds was on him, grabbing his arm roughly and spinning him around. Michael didn't resist. He knew better, but his patience was wearing thin. "What's this about, officer? You seem nervous," Reynolds taunted. "Something illegal in the car? Maybe some drugs? Weapons?" Michael clenched his jaw. "You have my credentials. You know exactly who I am. There's nothing illegal in that vehicle." Reynolds leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Maybe, but let's see if we can find a reason to change that." A chill ran through Michael's spine. He had heard of cases like this before: fabricated charges, planted evidence, situations that spiraled out of control. His pulse quickened, not out of fear, but out of anger. Reynolds wanted a reaction. He wanted Michael to lash out, to resist, to give him an excuse. But Michael Anderson had spent years learning patience, mastering discipline. He wasn't about to break now. Instead, he took a slow breath and looked Reynolds directly in the eye. "You don't know who you're messing with," Michael said quietly. Reynolds grinned. "Oh, I think I do." But he was wrong. And before the night was over, he would realize just how badly he had miscalculated. The cold night air pressed against Colonel Michael Anderson's skin as he stood beside his vehicle, his hands still visible. Officer Travis Reynolds circled him like a predator, the faint smirk on his face growing as if savoring the moment. "You military guys think you're so damn special," Reynolds muttered, shaking his head as he unbuckled the strap on his holster. "Think that uniform makes you untouchable." Michael remained calm, his training keeping his emotions in check. "I think the law applies to everyone equally, officer." Reynolds let out a sharp laugh. "That so? Let's find out." He reached for his radio. "Dispatch, I've got a possible 10 to 32 here. Vehicle occupied by a suspicious male, refusing to comply." Michael's stomach twisted. A 10 to 32, a call for an armed suspect. He wasn't armed. His service pistol was locked away at home, miles from here. But in a situation like this, perception could be more dangerous than reality. A response crackled through the radio. "Backup is en route, DA 5 minutes." Michael could see where this was going. He had witnessed injustice overseas, but there was something uniquely cruel about facing it in the country he had sworn to defend. 5 minutes. That was all the time he had before things could spiral completely out of control. Just then, another car pulled up behind Reynolds' cruiser. A second patrol car. The door swung open, and out stepped Officer Daniel Hayes, a younger, leaner man with cautious eyes. Unlike Reynolds, his stance wasn't aggressive. He walked up carefully, his eyes flicking between the two men. "Travis, what's going on?" Hayes asked, glancing at Michael's uniform. "This guy military?" "Yeah, and?" Reynolds shot back. "Doesn't mean he gets a free pass." Hayes studied Michael, his gaze narrowing as he noted the rank insignia on his shoulder. "Wait a second. Colonel Anderson? Fort Benning?" Michael nodded. Hayes exhaled sharply. He turned to Reynolds, lowering his voice. "Man, do you know who this is?" Reynolds rolled his eyes. "Don't care." He was driving erratically. "No, he wasn't," Hayes said firmly. He looked at Michael again. "Colonel, did you refuse an order?" Michael shook his head. "No, officer. I was simply following protocol and making sure my rights were respected." Hayes' jaw tightened. He had seen enough bad stops to know when something was wrong. "Travis, let's just run his info and let him go," Hayes muttered under his breath. But Reynolds wasn't listening. He was already reaching for his handcuffs. "I said, turn around." Michael's fingers twitched, his patience thinning. He had let this go far enough. "I'd like to call my commanding officer," he said. Reynolds smirked. "You think you get a phone call?" Hayes stepped forward, placing a hand on Reynolds' arm. "Travis, that's enough. Back off." Reynolds turned on him. "You got a problem, Hayes?" Hayes didn't back down. Yeah. I do. We're not arresting an army colonel on a fabricated charge. For the first time, Reynolds hesitated. Michael saw it, the flicker of doubt, the realization that he wasn't in complete control anymore. The distant sound of sirens broke the tension. Backup was almost here. Reynolds cursed under his breath. Fine. He's free to go. But as Michael reached for his documents, Reynolds leaned in close, his voice low and venomous. "This ain't over," he whispered. Michael didn't respond. He simply took his license and registration, got back into his vehicle, and drove away, knowing that this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Colonel Michael Anderson sat in his home office the next morning, the events of the night still fresh in his mind. The aroma of Lisa's coffee lingered in the air, but he couldn't bring himself to drink it. His wife had been furious when he told her what had happened. "They what?" she had practically shouted, gripping the kitchen counter. "Michael, this is outrageous. You need to report him." He knew she was right. But he also knew how these things usually played out. Reynolds had made it clear, this wasn't over. And men like him, when backed into a corner, had a tendency to lash out. But Michael wasn't just any man. He had spent his entire career standing up to bullies, on and off the battlefield. And he wasn't about to stop now. Later that afternoon, Michael made his way to the Internal Affairs Division of the local police department. He had already called his JAG, Judge Advocate General, officer, who assured him that Fort Benning's legal team would support him in filing an official complaint. He walked into the building with the same composed authority he carried on the battlefield. A woman at the front desk, Sergeant Julia Ramirez, looked up. "Can I help you, sir?" "Yes," Michael said, pulling out a folder containing his military credentials and a written statement. "I'm here to file a formal complaint against Officer Travis Reynolds." The room tensed. Ramirez's brows furrowed as she reached for the folder. "Officer Reynolds?" "Yes. I was stopped last night under false pretenses. He attempted to intimidate me, fabricate charges, and escalate the situation without cause." Ramirez pursed her lips. She glanced toward an office door at the end of the hall. "One moment, sir." Michael watched as she disappeared into the office. A minute later, the door swung open, and a heavy-set man with graying hair stepped out. Captain David Monroe. "Colonel Anderson," Monroe greeted, extending a hand. "I'm Captain Monroe. Why don't you step into my office?" Inside the office, Michael laid out everything: his military background, the traffic stop, Reynolds' threats, and Officer Hayes' intervention. Monroe listened intently, his expression unreadable. When Michael finished, Monroe exhaled. "Colonel, I'm going to be honest with you. This isn't the first complaint we've had about Reynolds." Michael's jaw tightened. "Then why is he still on the force?" Monroe leaned back, rubbing his temples. "Because proving misconduct is difficult when it's one officer's word against another's. And let's just say, Reynolds has friends in high places." Michael nodded slowly. He had seen corruption before. But he also knew something men like Reynolds always underestimated: the power of a well-documented case. "I assume your department has body cameras?" Michael asked. Monroe hesitated. "Yes." "Then I suggest you pull the footage from last night." Michael's voice was calm, but firm. "And while you're at it, I'd also like a meeting with the mayor and police chief." Monroe studied him for a long moment, then sighed. "I'll see what I can do." 2 days later, the meeting was set. Michael arrived at City Hall dressed in full uniform. His presence alone commanded respect. Across from him sat Police Chief Samuel Grayson, Mayor Elizabeth Cartwright, Captain Monroe, and Reynolds himself. Reynolds sneered as soon as Michael walked in. "Oh great, the colonel's here to whine." Michael didn't react. Instead, he turned to Grayson. "Chief, have you reviewed the footage?" Grayson nodded. His face was grim. He turned to Reynolds. "Officer Reynolds, would you like to explain why you falsely radioed in a 10 to 32? Reynolds' smirk faltered. "I had reason to believe." "You had no reason," Grayson snapped. "You knew exactly who Colonel Anderson was. And yet, you chose to escalate the situation, ignore protocol, and attempt to intimidate a decorated officer of the United States Army." Reynolds clenched his jaw. "So what? He got away clean, didn't he?" Michael finally spoke, his voice steady but sharp. "I didn't get away, officer. I refused to let you turn me into a statistic." A tense silence filled the room. Mayor Cartwright folded her hands on the table. "Officer Reynolds, you have a history of complaints. But this time, we have clear evidence of misconduct." Reynolds' face paled. "Now, hold on. You're fired." Grayson didn't let him finish. "Effective immediately." Reynolds shot up from his chair. "You can't do this." Monroe stood as well, stepping between him and the mayor. "Actually, we can." Michael met Reynolds' eyes, seeing the panic beneath the anger. "I told you, officer. You didn't know who you were messing with." Reynolds stormed out, slamming the door behind him. Justice had been served. But Michael knew this fight wasn't just about him. It was about ensuring that no one, military or civilian, would have to face what he did ever again. And he was just getting started. The tension in the room lingered even after Officer Reynolds stormed out. Colonel Michael Anderson sat still, his hands clasped together, observing the reactions of those around him. Chief Grayson let out a slow breath, rubbing his temples. "I want an internal review of all cases Reynolds has been involved in over the past 5 years," he instructed Captain Monroe. "Every single complaint, every stop he made. If there's a pattern, we're going to find it." Monroe nodded. "Understood." Michael appreciated the sentiment, but he wasn't naive. Firing Reynolds was a victory, but it wasn't the end. Corruption didn't exist in isolation. If Reynolds had been getting away with this for years, it meant someone had been looking the other way. Mayor Cartwright turned to Michael, her expression one of genuine gratitude. "Colonel, I can't thank you enough for bringing this to our attention. I'm ashamed this happened in our city." Michael met her gaze evenly. "With all due respect, Madam Mayor, what matters now is what you do next. One bad officer is gone, but how many more are still out there? How many people weren't as lucky as me?" Cartwright sighed, nodding. "You're right. And I don't intend to sweep this under the rug. We're going to push for a full audit of the department. Any officers with histories of misconduct will be held accountable." Michael appreciated the words, but words were just the beginning. Outside the department, the real world was already reacting. News of Reynolds' firing spread quickly. Local media picked up the story, painting two stark narratives. Some saw Michael as a hero, a man who stood his ground against corruption and injustice. Veterans organizations and military officials voiced their support, praising his patience and discipline in the face of provocation. Others, however, took Reynolds' side, claiming he was just a cop doing his job and that Michael was trying to humiliate law enforcement. Online forums buzzed with heated debates, and within days, the story had gone national. Michael's phone rang off the hook, calls from fellow officers, military friends, even a few high-ranking officials who offered their support. Some warned him to lay low, that taking on the system was dangerous. But Michael had never been the kind of man to back down from a fight. A few days later, Michael was surprised to get a call from Officer Daniel Hayes, the one cop that night who had tried to de-escalate things. "Colonel," Hayes said, his voice uncertain. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for what happened." "You weren't the one who needed to apologize, officer," Michael replied. Hayes hesitated. "Maybe not. But I didn't do enough. I should have stopped him sooner." Michael respected the man's honesty. "Then do something about it now." The pause. Then Hayes sighed. "I already have. I put in my resignation this morning." That surprised Michael. "Why?" Hayes exhaled heavily. "I can't work for a department that lets guys like Reynolds operate for years without consequences. If I stay, I'm complicit." Michael respected that. It wasn't easy to walk away from a career, but it was the right thing to do. "What's next for you?" Michael asked. Hayes chuckled lightly. "Thinking about private security. Maybe even federal work. I just know I can't stay here." Michael nodded. "Well, if you ever need a recommendation, I'll be happy to give one." Hayes seemed genuinely touched. "That means a lot, Colonel." "Thank you." As they ended the call, Michael knew that while one battle had been won, the war against injustice would always continue. But it only took one voice to start a change. And he had made sure his was heard. Days passed and then weeks. The immediate storm around Officer Travis Reynolds' firing had begun to settle, But the ripples it created had not. The internal review of the police department uncovered troubling patterns, multiple complaints against Reynolds that had been ignored, questionable traffic stops, and even reports of excessive force that had never been properly investigated. Captain Monroe and Chief Grayson followed through with their promise, launching a department-wide reform initiative. Some officers resigned before their records could be examined. Others faced disciplinary action. Mayor Cartwright announced the formation of a civilian oversight board, ensuring that future complaints wouldn't be buried in bureaucracy. For the first time in years, there was a real push for change in the department. Colonel Michael Anderson followed these developments with a quiet satisfaction. He had seen too much in his years of service to believe that corruption could be rooted out overnight. Change was slow, often met with resistance. But this was a start. Sitting on his front porch one evening, he watched the sun dip below the horizon. Lisa stepped outside, handing him a glass of iced tea. "You did the right thing," she said softly, sitting beside him. Michael nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. "I keep thinking about the people Reynolds pulled over before me. How many of them didn't have a uniform to protect them? How many just had to accept whatever he threw at them?" Lisa reached for his hand. "And how many people won't have to deal with him anymore because of what you did?" That thought settled over him. He had always believed that leadership wasn't just about commanding troops, it was about protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. This fight hadn't been on a battlefield overseas. It had been right here, in his own backyard. And it mattered just as much. A few days later, Michael received an email from Officer Daniel Hayes. "Just wanted to update you. I got an offer for a federal security position. Looks like leaving the force was the best decision I could have made. Thank you for standing up when you did. If you hadn't, I don't know if I ever would have found the courage to walk away." Michael smiled. This wasn't just about one bad cop losing his job. It was about people recognizing the difference between right and wrong and having the courage to act on it. That night, Michael sat down at his desk, staring at a blank document on his computer. He titled it, "The Cost of Silence: Why We Must Hold Power Accountable." He wasn't done fighting. He never would be. Because justice wasn't something that happened on its own. It was something people had to stand up for. And he would make sure they did.